Think shaker cards are messy, bulky, and just not worth the effort? Give me the next few minutes to prove you wrong because these tiny spring sprinkles are about to completely transform this Easter scene, and I'm sharing the exact trick to get that perfect shimmer and shake without all the bulk. Hippity hoppity, Easter is on its way. Hi friends, I'm Revati, and today we are bringing all the fresh spring vibes into our craft room with this charming Easter shaker window card. We are working with the sweetest little bunnies, soft spring colors, and a mix of texture that truly bring the scene to life. Let's get started. I'm starting off with these absolutely gorgeous little bunnies from the Hippity Hoppity Bunny stamp set. I mean, just look at how sweet those faces are. Now they are almost too cute to handle. Well, I went ahead and stamped three of them onto a piece of white cardstock and heat embossed them using clear embossing powder to give those outline a nice and crisp finish. That little bit of shine really helps everything keep neat and polished once we start coloring in. Now, here's something I always love doing is that I like to die cut my images before I color them in. That way, I don't risk any die cutting mishaps after spending all that time on that beautiful coloring. There's nothing worse than a perfectly colored image and then slightly off die cut, trust me. But I'm curious, what about you? Do you prefer to die cut first or do you prefer to color and run everything together through your die cutting machine? Let me know in the comments. I love seeing how everyone's creative process is a little different. Normally, I would just place my die cuts onto a scrap piece of paper or directly onto my glass mat while coloring. But here's a little trick that is especially useful when you're working with smaller images like these. You can place them onto a temporary adhesive sheet or a tape, or do what I did here and stick them onto the sticky edge of a post it note. Now, that slight tackiness is just enough to hold your pieces in place while you color without tearing the paper when you lift them off. It keeps everything from sliding around and makes the whole process so much more easier. Now, for coloring, I kept things fairly simple and reached for my absolute favorite, my Uhuhu alcohol markers. I used a light shade of gray for the bunnies to keep them soft and sweet, and then brought in some bright, vibrant colors for the flowers, the balloons, and a cheerful pop of orange for the carrot. One thing I really love about these markers is that they have both brush tip and a fine tip. The brush tip is perfect for blending larger areas like the entire body of the bunny, but when it comes to those tiny little details like the bows on our bunnies, I switch to the fine tip to get in those little tiny spaces without going outside the lines. Now, simple coloring, bright spring colors, and just enough detail to make these cuties really stand out. To finish off the coloring, I added the tiniest little pink dots on each of those bunnies' little cheeks. And oh my goodness, that one small little detail made such a difference, and they look even more sweeter and full of personality. Well, towards the end, I just used two of these bunnies, and the bunny holding the balloon, I would probably put her on the inside of the card or use her for another project. Now, to begin creating the base of our ground, I used the Tuck It In add-on craft die. I used the hilly border and ran it through a strip of white cardstock to create that soft rolling hill look. To add a little more interest and dimension to our ground, I bought in one of the tiny carrots from the Carrot Fun die set. It is such a sweet detail and it really helps tie the whole scene together. Now, there are four sizes, but I chose the smallest one. Before adhering anything down, I used the tuck it in die to cut a small slit through that grassy hill. This creates a perfect little opening to tuck our carrot into it, almost like it's growing out right from the ground. Now, I love the interactive details like this because they make the scene feel more thoughtful and cohesive. And since we have that adorable bunny holding the carrot, this little element on the ground just brings everything together so beautifully. It's those small touches that really elevate the card from cute to extra special. I colored in the carrot using the same exact color combinations that I used for the carrot, which our little bunny is holding. Now, of course, you could absolutely cut your hill from craft cardstock or any solid shade of brown and call it done, but I personally love adding my own custom color. There's something about ink blending your own browns that gives the ground so much more life and character, I feel. Instead of keeping it perfectly smooth and even, I like to blend in a very splotchy, uneven way. I layer a few different shades of browns from my stash and just build up the color gradually. It doesn't have to be perfect. In fact, the more imperfect it looks, the more natural it feels. Little darker patches here and there almost mimic real soil and give the scene that organic, earthy texture. So don't stress about any kind of flawless blending. Just play around with the browns you already have, mix light and darker tones, and let it look a little messy. That's what makes it more realistic and adds so much more depth to your card. Now, since this is going to be a shaker card, the next step was to build our window frame. I die cut a frame from white cardstock to keep everything looking clean and crisp. Then I layered my ink blended hill right along the base of that frame using liquid glue. Once it was secure, I went ahead and trimmed off any excess cardstock hanging over the edges so that we could have a nice polished finish. Now here's how we are actually going to assemble the shaker. The hill is actually going to be sandwiched between our white frame and the acetate sheet. But instead of placing the hill behind the acetate, I wanted it sitting on top of the acetate layer simply because this is where we'll be tucking in our little carrot and adhering those die-cut bunnies. By keeping those elements on top of the acetate, they stay nice and crisp and become part of the main focal point layer. Now, instead of getting visually lost behind all of those shaker bits. Now, the best part, all of that matte cardstock and the beautiful ink blended texture sitting on top of that clear, shiny acetate will create a beautiful contrast. Now, talking about the background, at first I was planning to create a soft blue ink blended sky with fluffy white clouds, which would have been beautiful, but at the very last minute, I decided to switch things up and use a pattern paper instead. This is the one from Will You Work for Craft Supplies paper pad. And honestly, I absolutely love this choice. The gorgeous blue shade paired with the subtle textured pattern makes the background feel extra special. Alright, now we are ready for the fun part, which is assembling the shaker window. I started by adding double-sided tape all along the edge of the frame. Since this frame is pretty thin, I prefer using double-sided tape instead of liquid glue. The last thing we want is any of that glue seeping out and showing through our acetate. That would totally ruin that clean and polished look of our card. Once the acetate window was secured, I flipped the panel over and added foam tape all around the back to create that raised edge. This is what will give our shaker window dimension and allows those sprinkles to move freely inside our window. And here's a little design tip you'll notice. I added extra foam tape along the bottom, right behind the hill. That's intentional. If we don't reinforce that area, the sprinkles could slide down and get stuck behind the hill when the card is standing upright. By sealing that section off, we can make sure that the sprinkles stay visible and continue to shake beautifully in the open sky area. It's those tiny construction details that really make your shaker card feel professional and thoughtfully designed. To fill in the shaker window, I chose some of the most beautiful pastel toned sprinkle mixes to keep the soft springtime vibe. I'm using two of my favorites, the Hoppy Days Sprinkle and the Spring Fling Sprinkle. Both of these mixes are just dreamy. They have those gorgeous soft pastel colors and they even include tiny floral details that make the shaker so whimsical and perfect for Easter. Now, these little sprinkles really bring the scene to life, and when they move around inside the shaker, they just add the right amount of sparkle and motion without overwhelming our cute little bunnies and the hill on the foreground. Now, one little tip I want to give a special mention to is this. Before adding any of those sprinkles, I took a small paintbrush and lightly dabbed some anti-static powder all around the edges of the foam tape. This simple step helps prevent any of those tiny shaker bits from sticking to the edge of the foam tape so that they can move freely and don't get clumped or staticky. Once I did that, I removed the backing from the foam tape and then I added all of the shaker elements. Also, a little note on the shaker fill philosophy is that I don't want to load my shaker window with a ton of those beautiful sprinkle mix. I want the sprinkles to pop and move, but I also don't want them to overpower the background or steal attention from our focal point images. Keeping it just right ensures everything looks balanced, soft, and still keeps that whimsical Easter time vibe. Once I'm happy with the amount of shaker elements inside the window, it's time to close it up and seal it perfectly. I will press the edges firmly, which will ensure that the window is completely sealed so that none of those little sprinkles can escape through any gaps. Taking a moment here to press evenly also helps keep the foam tape snug against the acetate, which gives a clean professional finish and keeps the shaker elements moving smoothly inside our window. Next, we can start assembling all of those little colored and die cut images. I start by tucking in our little carrot inside that little gap on the hill. Now, I did use liquid glue here, which will make sure that the carrot stays in place. Then I added the bunny with the carrot and followed by the bunny with a little flower. Since our shaker card already has so much dimension, I decided to adhere all of those elements using liquid glue. It gives a strong hold without adding any extra bulk, so everything stays perfectly in place. For our sentiment, I chose the Hippity Hoppity sentiment stamp. I stamped the sentiment that says, Hippity Hoppity, Easter is on its way, onto a piece of white cardstock and heat embossed it with clear embossing powder to give it that crisp raised finish, also matching the stamping and heat embossing on the little bunnies. Once my sentiment was ready, I trimmed it into a neat sentiment strip and placed it right in the center of our frame. And just like that, the main structure of our card is complete. Once that was done, adding the tiny little finishing touches and little details was all that's remaining. That'll bring our card front to life and will give it a more polished Easter like feel. To finish things off, I added a few tiny brown dots on the hill to give a little extra texture and make it feel more natural. Just those small details really help the scene come alive. For the bunnies and the carrots, I added highlights using my white gel pen. Now, if this were a flat card and not an interactive shaker card, I would definitely add some sparkle with a glitter brush pen. But since we already have those beautiful sprinkles in the background and a shiny acetate window, I decided to skip the glitter and keep it simple with just the white highlights. And with those little finishing touches, our charming Easter shaker card is officially complete. It's playful, springy, and full of movement, a perfect little scene to celebrate the season. I hope you enjoyed watching today's video and got inspired to create your little Easter scene. I will leave the links to all the supplies that I used to create this card in the description box below. Please note that all of those links are affiliate links, which means that if you shop using one of my links, I'll get a small commission at no cost to you guys. Thank you again for joining me today. Until next time, stay safe.